Hello and welcome back to The Record Process. This week you will hear part 2 of our exclusive 2-part Takeover series dedicated to the incredibly talented artists that will be taking part in the first annual No Earbuds Festival, put together by LA-based publicist and dear friend of The Record Process, Jamie Coletta. If you've listened to The Record Process before, then you'll know that we're pretty much obsessed with the question of why. Why do records sound the way they do? Why do artists make the creative choices that they do? Each week, we aim to explore all of these contributing factors, from the places that they were recorded, to the people that capture them and perform on them, and even the ideas that inspire the songs themselves. But for this episode of The Record Process, we thought it might be fun to zoom out a little bit and explore some of the influences that had a heavy hand in creating the career trajectory for a few of the artists on the upcoming No Earbuds Festival lineup. So sit back and enjoy the excerpts from our conversations coming right up after this. One of the toughest hurdles for musicians and producers to overcome is recognizing when it's time to let your music go. So stop letting your music sit there on a hard drive waiting for the perfect label scenario to show up. Let DistroKid help you start reaching the fans you deserve right now. There's a reason why DistroKid is the go-to platform for independent musicians across all genres, and it's because they offer seamless and affordable solutions to distribute your music worldwide. Get your tracks on all the most popular streaming platforms like Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, and so many more in just a few steps. Time is often money, and DistroKid understands that. So they've eliminated long wait times for processing your music in the system. And in fact, they can get your music live in as little as 24 to 48 hours now. The simplicity of the platform and features like automatic revenue splits and YouTube content IDs make distributing your music and collecting payments incredibly simple. DistroKid does not take a percentage of your royalties, and for one low annual fee, you keep 100% of what you own. It's straightforward, transparent, and affordable. So follow the link in our show notes to get 30% off your new DistroKid membership and start letting your music work for you. If you're a solo musician, a singer, a songwriter, or part of a band, you know that the journey does not end once you have that finished master in hand. Building a lasting career around your music requires a lot of additional activities to do things like develop, promote, and ultimately monetize your creative vision. And for those of us that aren't quite doing Taylor Swift level numbers yet, it helps to have a merchandising partner that can meet you where you're at right now. And SmartPunk MFG is a perfect solution for any and all merch manufacturing needs your band might have. From the first note to the final stitch, they have it all covered with whatever you might need. They do screen printing, they do embroidery, stickers, vinyl and CD production, posters, and pretty much everything else under the sun. They are an incredibly comprehensive online merch solution, offering reasonable prices and feasible quantities for bands of all sizes. So go check out some samples of what they can do at smartpunkmfg.com. And when you're ready, just shoot them an email at info@smartpunkmfg.com and mention The Record Process to get 10% off your first order. So remember, that's Smartpunk MFG, and it's where creativity meets manufacturing excellence. And so I was curious early on who maybe musically rubbed off on you and the rest of the band, you know, whether you want to take it all the way back from like an early age childhood or even, you know, more recently, because I think that has a lot to do with how the things we create sound and what we think, you know, our idea of executing something great is, right?
As far as Perennial goes and starting this band, in particular, there were a few artists that were really foundational for us. One thing that I remember pretty distinctly is picking up the album Sound Verite by The Makeup, where they're this great like garage soul band from the 90s, and just absolutely loving that record and seeing that as sort of an example of the kind of thing that Chelsea and I were talking about doing, which was forming a band that was really pulling together the stuff that we really loved, which was a lot of DC post-hardcore stuff, bands like Refused and The Hives, so sort of, you know, that sort of version of garage / post-hardcore. And then a lot of 60s soul that we were super into. Otis Redding Wilson Pickett, Martha and the Vandellas, stuff like that. And listening to that Makeup record that was sort of playing around with those same sounds was just this kind of lighting of the fuse, where we said, all right, here's something cool that is sort of playing in that same blend of genres. And then from there, we just always looked at Perennial as a project where we could try out whatever we liked in terms of things that inspired us, things that we were always listening to. As long as it had energy and as long as we were excited about doing it, then we could make it make sense for whatever Perennial was going to be with each new record. Going all the way back, so the stuff I listened to when I was super young, like 5 years old, the stuff that I really grew up with was very much Motown, Atlantic, Stax, soul stuff. One of the earliest sort of tapes that I sort of called mine, or would be in my room, was the Big Chill soundtrack, which had Marvin Gaye and Smokey Robinson and the Miracles and the Temptations and Aretha Franklin. And I just listened to that endlessly. And I think the way those songs are put together and the way that they sort of are these compact sonic worlds that have all these layers, and they're also 3-minute pop songs, was foundational and fundamental to me. From there, the first sort of rock and roll music that I was getting into in my early teens was stuff like the Beatles and the Who, which are still, along with like Motown and Stax, sort of the foundation of what we do. And at the end of the day, if we're listening to something that's sort of really sort of deep inside of us as artists, it's stuff like that. It's that 60s British Invasion stuff was absolutely huge. And from there, mid-teens, discovering punk and bands like At the Drive-In, for instance, and Refused. And from there, finding the bands that you could tell were influencing them, were maybe a little more obscure, a little harder to find. You had to go to like the record store in the nearest college town to find it, because this was a little bit before buying music online was quite the thing. And just the fun of that sort of, it as a process of discovery adds a certain something to it that makes you sort of cling to it even more.
For many developing and emerging artists, the era of streaming in which we live and the audience who ultimately finds your music within it is very heavily predicated on discovery through playlists. But this concept isn't new, and in many ways is just the modern reflection of finding our own identity and sharing that with the world through a mixtape or mix CDs. So when we spoke with Lizzie Killian of the band Teens in Trouble about her influences, it was really interesting to hear how playlists and specific song references were actually at the heart of her collaboration on her newest album.
I guess the oldest song here that I've listened to many, many times is Something by the Beatles. But that was very specific for like the last song on the album, I'm Not Perfect. We were in the studio, we were calling it the Beatles song.
Talk to us about that, the Beatles song, and how you kind of downloaded this playlist and the references there one by one.
Lizzie and I have a lot of, like you were saying, a lot of like similar musical backgrounds. So when it came to like specific moments, we would like point those references more, specifically with the playlist. But for the Beatles thing, so there was a couple songs that Lizzie sent me demos to, one of them being the Beatles song, that I just never made a demo to because I was like, we'll figure this out in the studio, And a lot of that has to do with the drummer, Henry, who played on the record, or all the recordings. He might as well be like a Beatle reincarnate. He is so like in tune with like, there's a take where it's just like 5 minutes of Ringo fills at the end. Just give it to me. Just keep giving it to me.
Amazing.
Yeah. And there's times where I'm like working on the bass. I'm like, is this whimsical enough? Is this too Paul? Like,
Yeah.
I think a lot of that comes from is like, going back to like seeing what the song wants to be and the chasing like, songs that take you back to a certain time or vibes or anything like that. And I think a lot of that song lyrically doesn't necessarily have to lend to a whimsical setting like that, but contrasting two elements together I think make the song really interesting and like somber, but also very hopeful.
In our conversation with the members of Glass Beach, reminded us that although a lot of our influences can often come from other artists that have paved the way in a specific genre and showed us what was possible, it's also possible to find inspiration much closer to home.
Jeff Rosenstock is like probably the biggest musical influence to me personally. Just in the way that I like write music and the way that I appreciate other music. I really love like the rawness and, you know, the sort of raucous behavior that Jeff Rosenstock sort of portrays. And then my really sappy sentimental answer is Jonas, our bass player, because meeting Jonas in college and growing as like a songwriter through like seeing the way that they wrote music and everything was just like heavily influential. I don't think I would have been a genuinely serious songwriter and musician if it wasn't for Jonas. So that's my answer.
I like you framing the influence thing here as like a personal thing, because that's a totally different thing. And for me, a big influence there was when I first moved out to LA. I was crashing with a friend of mine, William from this one, who sings in a band and just like fronts this emo band called Carol's Walk Home. I was crashing on his couch, and it was kind of one of those things where it was like supposed to be for like a month tops, and then it was like almost a whole year. But it was very, very nice and hospitable, and we had a lot of great conversations about music. And he also is very of that approach of just kind of directness, especially a sort of like authenticity and like vocals and stuff. Like he's not a very trained technical singer or whatever, but he's the type where like you always like you believe every word of it, and I think that period was when I wrote a lot of the first Glass Beach songs, and he was a big influence in my mentality there. And then another one kind of in a different vein, but like around that same time, I had this project called Cassiodad that was like a chiptune punk something or other project that was kind of a prototype for early Glass Beach. And I got to say, playing with the LA chiptune scene in that time, it was like such an interesting environment. You had people doing like straight up chiptune with like Game Boys and stuff, and then you had people going into more like future bass, like kind of a bunch of different electronic sounds and stuff. And it was a culture that was very accepting of a lot of different types of people, very queer friendly and stuff. There would be bands who were they were just like cis guys or whatever, but would like wear dresses on stage and shit. And it really it was really cool to I don't know, see that kind of environment. The music was very interesting. you mash that up with the influence of like Kara's Walk Home, and that was kind of the seed for Glass Beach early on.
Awesome. I love that so much. And talking about like how the residue that comes along with you through different projects and groups of people is not always just like musical or instrumental, or you know what I mean? It's also sometimes in the approach of like that gives you the energy to kind of veer off into left, right field, wherever you want to go, because you've just been in a scene that will incubate and foster almost anything, if it's interesting and somebody's doing it with conviction and it's exciting. I love that anecdote.
I'm going to throw it way back here. I had a friend in high school when I first started playing guitar who he also wanted to start learning how to play guitar. So we literally like every day for a couple of years, like would just, as soon as school was done, we would walk home from school to my place. And one of the first things I remember that we did is we just play around and whatnot. But then I remember we learned all the entirety or as much as we could of City of Evil from Avenged Sevenfold. He learned Zaki Vengeance's parts. I learned Sinister Gate's parts. And the cool thing about Jerry was that he was always finding new artists and whatnot. And we were finding artists in like different. It was really funny. I was doing a weird thing where I would scour the depths of YouTube for like weird music and whatnot. Jerry was always like a little ahead of the curve in a weird way. Like he'd be like, "Oh, I heard about this." Like I forgot what it was, but it was like there was one day, like as soon as it came out, he was like, yeah, I just heard about this like album that just came out. Someday Came Suddenly by Attack Attack, and I was like, and we listened to it, and I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. I see what's going on here. And then like immediately that blew up, and I was like, how did you find that so fast? But that was the whole thing. And I would kind of be remiss if I didn't mention that there was a period of time whenever I had a studio internship with Bo Burchell of Seos, and it was cool working with him for a number of reasons, but one of them was that like I think that he really like kind of hit me with a thing of just like stop thinking about stuff so much and just do it, because you're like there was a moment where I was like, we were working on one of the songs for the album that I was working on with my band at the time, Here Lies the Hero, and there was a song where we were just restructuring the entire thing, and there's a point where he was like, you know what, this could use a guitar solo. And I was like, cool, yeah, I can write something, and then like, you know, we can figure out some stuff. One night he's like, I'll tell you what, I'm gonna walk away, I'm gonna go make some copy, I'm going to hit record on, like, it's just going to be a punch in. Just go. And I was like, I don't know if I can do that. And he was like, you're a good guitarist, you can do it.
Yeah.
And so, like, he left and then came back. And then whenever he came back, I was like, I think I did something. And then he like, listened to it and he was like, yeah, this and this and this. And then we put it together and it was great. And that was kind of like a moment where I was like, damn, I need to stop second guessing my stuff and just do shit.
And just playing is the most important part.
Yeah.
You can paralyze that from just like overthinking, you know.
Yeah. Also not being too pristine.
Clean. Yeah.
With everything. Because that was one thing. I would play some stuff and there were times whenever you'd be like, can you like play that worse? And it would just do wonders for it sometimes. It was really cool.
Yeah, I love it. Play it worse.
I also had a lot of friends in high school that I like just surrounded myself with who are artists. And I think that's one of the most valuable things you can do if you want to be a songwriter or making art, is to incubate with other people as best you can. So I was very lucky with that. And I could name a lot of people. My dad was a musical influence my whole life and just made sure I heard a lot of music, which goes a long way too. But one of my friends in high school, Mackenzie, who I played with in a couple of bands and stuff, but he said something that has stuck with me to this day. They still say, but they were like, Mackenzie would listen to songs that he had made at school, just like kind of all day, just like as he listened to music, just like songs he made in GarageBand. And at one point, someone just like asked him about it. And he was like, yeah, of course I listen to the songs that I make. I write the songs I want to hear, so I'm going to listen to them. And like, I think that is very like valuable as well. And I kind of tried to carry that forward. It's like, what would I want to listen to out of the song that this is becoming? And I just kind of make that, and then I get to listen to it.
You know, in that process, you mentioned kind of using referential material, right? You know, and maybe other bands or other projects as shorthand in that communication language. What were some of the things, I'm curious, like, Lizzie, when you would volley an idea over, you know, were there influences or things that, you know, ways that you were conceptualizing, how, you know, an influential aspect of something from that you kind of put in front of Randy that maybe wasn't on your radar or as like heavily influential to you, Randy, but like made you take another look at it? You know, were there any bands or artists you know, that were brought up in terms of that?
It's sort of like all over the place. I feel like at a basic level, Randy and I both love Weezer. and there's a lot of
the ultimate common denominator in this space. Right. Honestly, we've found it. Yes.
And so like sometimes a lot of our early conversations are like, is it Blue Album or is it Pink Album or Pinkerton? And then from there we sort of like, I guess, expand on it a bit more. When I'm writing songs, I'm not really necessarily thinking about other bands or other songs, but then as it starts to take shape, I start to hear different things. Like, for instance, I put together this playlist of just sounds that I like, and I put that together a few days before we got into the studio just to sort of like figure out tones and like, oh, I like this guitar sound, or I like sort of like this rhythm. And I revisited that playlist pretty recently, and I was like, we don't sound like any of these bands at all.
Ooh, honestly, this sounds great. So Tom, as an acoustician and mix engineer, and this is one of my favorite things when I first met him, has a, you know, like room tuning reference playlist that he knows all the little ins and outs, nuances of each track and how it responds and how it should sound in a well-tuned mind or, unbalanced room, kind of things like that. Give me your version here, Lizzie. What's on this playlist? Because I think this is sometimes a really fun exercise and also is a great example of like, how far things can go, and they end up, in the conversation for one reason and then get taken to a whole different place. But what was on that?
Yeah, I guess like the sort of common thread here is a lot of them have like sort of nervous guitars. There's Hoop Jail. I don't know if you're familiar with them. There's a song Stranded Planet by them. Ducks Limited is on there. Culture Abuse, Be Kind to the Bugs. There's also like a lot of like vibey sort of like, oh, I like this vibe of like song. Pavement is on here.
What was some of the vibey stuff like that, and how did you qualify it when you kind of put it across in terms of, bringing it in?
Just to take that Hoop Jail song as an example, and the song Stranded Planet, it's just like, I don't even know what the lyrics are. It's just like you hear it and immediately you want to start like bobbing along to it. And that's sort of like how I thought about this album, where it's like, I want to be able to hear the songs and start like moving along to it. And I think that's something I mentioned to you, Randy, when we were actually in the studio and why it was important. Like when we were recording this, I really wanted to play along the Henry live versus how we approached the EP, which was like everything was sort of separate.
On the previous episode of this series, we talked about what makes great albums great. And one of the strongest factors that came up time and again was the idea of intent. And not only intent, but the clarity of that intent and the focus of what that album aims to do. And I think the same thing is true on a much smaller micro level within each song on that album. And Chad talked about his early influences from his childhood and the music that he downloaded from his parents, and how those influences were so fundamental in galvanizing his creative philosophy as a songwriter.
Chad, looking back now, can you like distill any elements from those like recordings that like are clearly reflective to like how you make music now?
I think so. I remember reading this interview with Smokey Robinson. I think the greatest American songwriter in history, and Smokey Robinson was talking about how really great pop songs operate on having sort of a clear idea or concept that the song is sort of built around, and thus you're sort of entering this world when you listen to that song, and it's very quickly identifiable, and it has perspective and all this sort of sonic world building to it. And that is something that I would point to that is really important to us, is sort of making sure that Perennial as a concept and the songs we record and the records we make have this sort of spatial quality, this world that you can enter, or that there is sort of always a concept there, that it is this exciting garage rock mod post-hardcore thing, but it's also you can sort of think of the larger idea around it as something you can spend time in.
Absolutely. That makes so much sense too, and that's a great way of putting it in terms of having its own kind of discernible identity and concept within a song. And sometimes I think a lot of pop music from the outside isn't always given that kind of credit, and having a very recognizable, cohesive front to back kind of identity and thing. And it's not always just about, okay, cool, here's another top line, here's some good lyrics. It's that how those frame a house that is not just another kind of cookie cutter thing that you can say, oh, that's very much like the standout house in this whole entire neighborhood that, feels like it was made differently and with a different intent. So I love that. And so you got some education from some early songwriting greats in that Motown era. When you kind of got up and out of the house, so to speak, and then you started, kind of going to the local record store kind of discovery end of things. Do you remember because that can also have sometimes its own sense of community and a lot of a built-in friend circle almost around, people that get real hungry to go crate diving and find some really cool obscure stuff. Do you have friends or people along the way, or even certain locations that you would go to as like sources of discovery. Again, assuming that a lot of this was probably done long before algorithms were deciding everything that got put in front of you. You know, you had to make some choices or find some actual human to human recommendations. So what was the catalyst for that in that period where you were discovering a lot of the post-punk stuff?
I grew up in suburban New England. So around that age when friends start to get their driver's license, we would drive to the record stores in 2 towns over in Northampton, Massachusetts, a beautiful city. You know, at the time it had like 3 or 4 record stores. So we were just doing a lot of just spending time there and whatever sort of money we could scrape together to buy stuff. And you're absolutely right. It was an era where you could find out a certain amount of stuff from sort of reading about it online. But I also distinctly remember once I figured out a record label like Jade Tree put out all these bands that I really liked, it really got to the point where I could just buy stuff that Jade Tree put out. The Promise Ring, and then Jets to Brazil, and eventually These Arms Are Snakes. And I think that was really educational to see that even though those bands are pretty distinctly different, there's something about how unique and idiosyncratic they each are about the way they're making the thing they're making. That felt like, oh, this all makes sense as falling under one label's umbrella, even if, you know, the distance between Nothing Feels Good by The Promise Ring and records by These Arms Are Snakes is pretty vast sonically. That was sort of what was fueling our music discovery at that age, and sort of our mid-teens, was discovering about certain labels that were putting out certain sounds. And then again, you would look for interviews with At the Drive-In or Thursday and see what they were talking about. And then, you know, you sort of follow that thread, and you're eventually listening to, like I said, Fugazi is sort of a great example of that, where you can sort of hear how what they're doing eventually turns into something like At the Drive-In or Thursday or what have you. And so it's really fun to find the sort of the branches off of that tree.
Outside of the labels, outside of the record stores, was there anything within the community, the live show community in that area that like really imprinted something on you?
I think going to DIY shows first. I was very lucky to grow up near 2 thriving areas of music at the time in sort of the Western Mass and Connecticut area. That was really influential in terms of, because it's a show at a house or a VFW or whatever, the point was the music, you know, particularly because it isn't possible when you're under 21. Bars or clubs were never really the default space for music. And so when you're going to see DIY shows that are in community centers or whatever, because music is so sort of definitively the point of being at those places, the conversation is just always around music. And, you know, there's whatever anyone is sort of putting on over the PA system between bands, and you hear something you like and you ask about it. Like, I can remember somebody putting on Death Cab for Cutie before I knew who that was, and sort of asking, you know, what is this? I think it was We Have the Facts. So it was, you know, the second, you know, very early on Death Cab stuff. And having somebody I could ask, because we're all just sort of hanging out in a room waiting for the next band to go on. And, you know, it's that community was just good for having conversations about music. And, you know, it's also that cool thing of when folks are starting their first or second bands and they're in high school or the early years of college, you pretty sort of fearlessly let the stuff that you like shape the stuff that you're making. So you can sort of find, oh, you know, what bands are you listening to? And then if you like this local band, you could dig into the stuff that's they were influenced by, and, you know, that sort of spreads out from there.
And Chad's right. Chasing the origin and influence behind the things that ignite your passion and fill you with energy can open up new layers of connection with that material, as well as opening up additional lanes of discovery for new music. And I think that's what Jamie Coletta does best. Everything she does is driven by her enthusiasm and her love of music as a fan first. And all of the actions that she takes in helping bands try to tell their story better are motivated by her belief in the impact that these bands can and should have on their scene. And it's people like Jamie and all of the artists that she works with that keep me inspired and keep us moving forward with the record process, all in an effort to highlight the nuance and artistry that goes into the craft of making records that move people. So thanks again for joining us. Make sure to follow the show on whatever platform you use to listen, because we'll be back in just a few short weeks with Season 7 of
The Record Process.